thank you. And I would like to thank the NICE for having organized this seminar, which is a pleasure and a privilege for me to speak at. Now, when we talk of India as an emerging global power, I want to touch upon a couple of things. First of all, a little bit of historical context, which is that if you look at history, India has always been a formidable presence in people's minds throughout the world. If you look at India and China together, for instance, the two largest countries in the world, they have dominated the world for most of known civilization in terms of the economy, for instance. As recently as just a few hundred years ago, India and China together accounted for nearly half the world's economy. The relative sizes have waxed and waned over the centuries, but a recent historical track record is interesting to keep track of. As recently as, say, 1980, the Indian and Chinese economies were roughly the same size. On per capita basis, they were very similar. Over the last 40 years, the Chinese economy has steadily grown, usually at double-digit rates, and has grown very highly to become the second largest economy in the world. Now, India has lagged behind the Chinese growth rate, but has also grown very dramatically itself. And in the last several years, in several quarters, India's growth rate has ranked as the fastest growing large economy in the world on many occasions. Now, this is a background context. The other thing I want to say is that we've been here before. India has been liberalizing its economy for 30 years, and we've seen ups and downs, which is normal in a democratic nation because it takes time to build consensus and keep policy decisions going forward. This is true of other democracies as well. The one thing I want to distinguish is in an earlier cycle, about 15 years ago, when India was once earlier the cynosure of world eyes in terms of a global investment destination and in terms of an emerging economic powerhouse, there was a certain hubris in India, as if India is destined to be a certain global economic superpower. Now, the reality is, destiny is what you make of it. And although there are many factors that go in favor of India, such as its size, its population, its demographics, we have a very large section of the population which is working age, and of course, we have democracy. Now, this time around, as India comes back into the cynosure of the world's eyes, there is clearly a difference in the sense that India is aware that rather than get caught up in hubris, it has to make the most of the opportunity that is afforded to us. So many commentators around the globe have talked about India becoming an emerging global power. Even as recently as this year, the new US President, Joe Biden, has said, the US, and I quote, the US welcomes India's emergence as a leading global power and its role as a net security provider in the region. Now, this is similar to many comments made on both economic and geopolitical forums for many years now. If you look at the situation where India is poised today, we faced some challenges in the last 2 years that are common to all nations around the world. The last year and a half has been a particular challenge because of the coronavirus pandemic, which has hit the economy, which has hit jobs, as it has all over the world. Before that, we had a period of a little more than a year when most of the global economy took a hit in terms of growth rates, as did India's, but India still remained above the average during that period. So if you take decadal averages, you go from the 1950s and 60s of having very slow growth rate, which was derisively called the Hindu rate of growth of 3 to 3.5%, to gradually coming up into the 5% range, 6% range, 7% range. And every decade on decade, India has continued to improve, especially in the last 30 years due to economic liberalization. And particularly under Prime Minister Modi, lots of big decisions which had been pending have been finally implemented. So I will just use one example, but I can literally use a dozen or more, which is the goods and services tax. Now, the goods and services tax, for the first time, unifies the Indian market as one market. Now, you can, a lot of people don't understand the importance of this until you realize that moving goods within India used to be more expensive, more time-taking than moving raw materials to, let us say, China or to Japan, which was an unnatural shackle that we had in the country. So internal barriers having been removed and 17 different rates of taxes having been boiled down to 4 rates of taxes makes a very significant difference in the economic situation of the country. Before I move on to India's perception of its role and India's bilateral and multilateral relationships in the neighborhood and around the world, I just want to highlight a few facts. The Prime Minister of India has set a milestone, which we were hoping earlier to achieve by next year, but perhaps will be delayed a little bit, which is to become a $5 trillion economy. Now that will happen, a little delayed because of the pandemic and other hurdles. But as we go forward, that's not the be all or the end all. India is going to grow much beyond that. Now, we have for quite some time been hearing that over the course of the next couple of decades, India will inevitably become the 3rd largest economy in the world. But you are already beginning to hear a little longer term projection, which projects that India might end up becoming the 2nd largest economy in the world by about 2050. Now, this is corroborated by a report by PricewaterhouseCoopers just 3 or 4 years ago. This stands on the basis of different aspects of the economy which are growing dramatically. So, for instance, the digital economy currently stands at only about $4.5 billion. But a McKinsey report estimates that this is headed towards 2.5 times growth in the next 3 or 4 years by 2025. Foreign direct investment, India received the 5th largest in 2020 at $64 billion. India is already the world's 2nd largest coal producer, the 2nd largest cement producer, the 2nd largest steel producer, and the 3rd largest generator of electricity. If you look at some of the other factors, India's telecommunications industry is already the 2nd largest in the world by number of mobile phones, smartphones, and internet users. Just to give you a couple more such factoids, our solar power capacity has grown from something like 2,500 megawatts to 40,000 megawatts, a growth of almost 20 times in the last 6 years. This reflects a mindset shift, because for decades, India and many developing countries have been arguing that we should share less of the burden of becoming a greener world economy, because the most of the contributors of the cause of climate change are the developed countries. Now, today, it may be that China and India are contributing a lot in terms of greenhouse gases, but on a per capita basis, it's one of the lowest. So the argument had been that as a developing nation, we needed a break. But this mindset shift under Prime Minister Modi, going from 2,500 megawatts to 40,000 megawatts and going to scale up much more on solar power, indicates that we are not going to get stuck on excuses for why we should invest less in greener technologies. We are just going ahead and doing it, becoming one of the most rapid green energy investments in the world. You've seen similar growth of highways. They have doubled in length from about 71,000 kilometers to more than 150,000 kilometers in the last 7 years. It's not just economic. If you look at the geopolitics of how India has shaped up, now, we suffered for many decades after independence because of what I call a mindset of inhibition based on our experience with global trade, based on our experience with colonialism. And because of that inhibition, because of that lack of self-confidence, we barricaded our economy. We had less interaction and wanted to be having less say in many of the important decisions of the world. Now, we've started coming out of that over the past couple of decades, particularly within the last 5 to 10 years. Membership in SCO, the Wassenaar Agreement, MTCR membership, the International Solar Alliance, and one that's getting talked about a lot is the Quad, which is a geopolitical arrangement with the US, Japan, Australia, and India. The Quad matters a lot because this is a coming together of democratic nations. I think we've seen the world go from a bipolar situation in the Cold War era to a unipolar situation with the United States being a sort of a global policeman from the early 90s onwards, to seeing a multipolar situation with the emergence of China and India and other nations. And now there is a feeling that democracies have a shared underlying philosophy which helps them to work together better, which helps them to have similar objectives. And that's why these kind of arrangements are beginning to have an importance, because democracies naturally favor more rules-based functioning. And that has not always been the case with other emerging superpowers. You have seen many nations have issues with the way China, which has benefited from these rules, which has benefited from WTO memberships, which has benefited from the free flow of trade and movement of ships, has now taken a different stand once it itself is the world's second largest economy. So these are some of the changes that are beginning to happen. And in terms of related to geopolitics, in terms of security arrangements, India has also started shedding its inhibitions, its diffidence, both on the economic front and the geopolitical front. I call this a transition from diffidence to confidence. So in terms of security arrangements, the LeMoa Pact with the US, the MLSA with France and Australia, the Military Logistics Pact with South Korea and Russia, and another one, the ACSA with Japan, are examples. India is still a developing nation, and it is knocking on the doors of middle income status. So let's not forget that this is not a destination, this is a journey. But even as India starts transitioning into middle income status, it has also started taking an interest in geopolitical matters, as I was mentioning, but also an interest in fostering relationships around the world in a belief that we must all work together. So just to cite some statistics, India's investment in developing nations around the world was $46 billion in 2019. And this is as per UNCTAD. And this is a growing figure. In the year 2010, India's investments in developing countries was 40 billion, and it has continued to keep on growing. The Indian government itself allocates nearly $1.5 billion every year, about 0.3% of the overall budget, solely for India's foreign aid program. So this is a transition that is in the middle of happening, where India has been transitioning from being solely an aid receiving country, which, you know, when I was growing up in the 1970s, that was the picture one had of India. But over recent years, India has started helping other nations who are facing natural calamities, or in helping in building their infrastructure, helping build their democratic structures. And so this is part and parcel of that transition. During this pandemic, India's outreach to other nations was exemplified. During this pandemic, India has offered assistance to more than 150 countries to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. It is helped by the fact that India is the world's largest manufacturer of generic drugs. And India's pharmaceutical sector fulfills about 50% of the global demand for vaccines. Just to give you one example, the Global Alliance for Vaccine and Immunizations, Gavi, which is one of the leading players in our fights against pandemics and other kinds of diseases, recently stated that 60% of the vaccines that Gavi purchases are manufactured in India. It's not just low-cost generic drugs manufacturing and vaccine manufacturing where India has such a lead, but what is important is that India has also started developing the capacity of developing new drugs. So of the 3 vaccines that have so far been approved in India, one was purely indigenously developed. One was the Oxford variant, and another one is the Russian vaccine that has been approved in India. I want to, as I come to the last phase of my presentation, I want to talk about India's views and efforts to reach out to its neighbors, especially its near neighbors. Now, for long, India has had a philosophy called Look East. And in recent years, that has been translated into the Act East policy, where we have gone ahead and entered into bilateral trade agreements with several Asian nations. And under Prime Minister Modi's leadership, a neglected part of India's policy started getting special attention, which is that we must have good relations with our immediate neighbors. We've had good relations, but the view that we can do better is something that is clearly enunciated by Prime Minister Modi. So if you look at both symbolic gestures as well as very meaningful policy steps, this is something that the government of India under Prime Minister Modi has very deliberately started doing. Starting from his first oath-taking as Prime Minister 7 years ago, when he reached out to the leaders of the SAARC countries to invite them and to have them attend, was a clear signal about where his priorities lay. And during his second swearing in as Prime Minister in 2019, he reached out to the BIMSTEC country leaders on our in the Bay of Bengal region. So this indicates the mindset. Now, if we come to, for example, Nepal, with which India has long historical and cultural ties, not to mention trade and other relationships. So India is the largest trading partner of Nepal, and the total bilateral trade has reached 58,000 crore rupees, which is a significant sum. And in the Indian mindset, there is a clear idea that with a country like Nepal, India can afford to have a very optimistic outlook, an outlook where it doesn't look at Nepal as something whose interests are not shared with our interests. And so in terms of our economic policies, in terms of our trade policies, there are many preferential items which have traditionally been there, but these are getting more accelerated. So if you look at the integration between the two nations, take, for example, India has started becoming a major hub for education. Apart from the ones that already existed, presently, there are 7 more Indian institutes of management, 7 more Indian institutes of technology, 14 more triple ITs, 14 more All India Institutes of Medical Sciences, and 90 medical colleges. These are all either completed in the last 7 years or under construction. And India is home to almost 50,000 students from 164 countries. But if you look at a little bit more detail, um, more than a quarter of that, more than 27% of those foreign students are from Nepal, from one country. I had mentioned earlier that India has reached out to provide assistance to about 150 countries during the pandemic with medicines, with vaccines, with medical kits, including PPE kits, which we started producing in scale only last year, ventilators, and so on and so forth. Just to give one example, India had sent more than 1 million, about 1.1 million vaccine doses to Nepal in January this year as part of the neighborhood first policy. So this is a policy that has been explicitly defined by Prime Minister Modi, that any aspect of our foreign policy has to begin with our immediate neighborhood. So the hubris which may have existed 15 years ago, where a lot of back offices from around the world were setting up in India, and some people may have had the mindset that with fiber optic connections, we are connected to the rest of the world. But it's very clear that we may have fiber optic connections to the rest of the world. And today we are having fiber optic connections to hundreds of thousands of villages in rural India, which is transforming India. But we live in a certain geography, and we have relationships with all our neighbors, and particularly with countries like Nepal, with whom there is a long historical and cultural tradition. The prioritization of that has to be raised, and it has been raised. So in coming to the very last part, I would like to cite that there are those that look at the glass as half full or the glass as half empty. A London School of Economics report assesses India's upcoming global power status and puts remarks in both columns. It says that India has formidable achievements in fostering democracy, in growth, and its cultural dynamism, but it mentions that it continues to have developmental challenges. And indeed, that is so, because we still are, as I said, at entering middle income status. But these developmental challenges are being taken up extremely rapidly. I mentioned the doubling of the highways in just under Prime Minister Modi. I've mentioned the surge in green energy. I have mentioned the unifying of the Indian market as one market for the first time under the GST. If you look at the ease of doing business index, this is something quite dramatic, because when Prime Minister Modi took office in 2014, India was ranked 142nd in the world by the World Bank's ease of doing business index. Now, this has grown dramatically to go to 63rd position last year. As we come out of the pandemic, and the projections are that India will be roaring back with double-digit growth this year, the Prime Minister's stated objective is that we must be at least in the top 50 of the world in ease of doing business index, and then aim higher is sure to come through because of the many house cleaning activities taken. I can give many, many examples. I will end with just one example, is that many people who deal with India complain about the red tape, complain about the bureaucracy, many of which are a legacy from colonial times. In these last few years, close to 1,500 or more obsolete laws relating to doing business in India have been eliminated. These go back to the mid-19th century that had completely obsolete purposes. And as we shift out of this pandemic, like I was saying, India is set to be a growing economy. It is, as I said, not a destination. It is a journey. But clearly, while we may have some blips along the road, economically, we will keep on growing to very significant status by any estimate. And in terms of geopolitics, in terms of having a shared interest, especially with democratic nations and especially with neighborhood nations, the path is quite clear from the both the symbolic and the solid policy decisions that have been taken in just the recent past. Thank you very much. I will be very happy to answer questions as we go forward.
Mr. Jay Panda, thank you very much for very insightful remarks. Since we have limited time and we are flooded with questions, we would like to share the question without any delay. The first question is that Prime Minister Modi has given importance to India's neighbours through India's neighbourhood first policy. He invited the head of the state of SAARC countries during his swearing ceremony in 2014 and head of BIMSTEC country in 2019. He started his first foreign visit from Bhutan, followed by Nepal. So how do you evaluate India's neighbourhood first policy?
As I was saying, I think there are several aspects to this. First of all, these symbols of the ones that you just mentioned, having SAARC nation heads of government come to India, having BIMSTEC heads of government come to India for our government's installation, and for beginning his foreign visits, Prime Minister Modi going to Bhutan and Nepal first, they're more than symbolic. They send a message loud and clear about our priorities and about the specific policy decisions that I was mentioning, such as reaching out with vaccines, reaching out with medicines, reaching out during natural disasters. These should be instinctive and are becoming more and more instinctive to the Indian mindset. And finally, of course, I mentioned trade, the trade that has been growing. Of course, with Pakistan, we have a particular problem because of cross-border terrorism. But trade with Bangladesh, trade with Nepal, and trade with other countries has been growing dramatically. Bangladesh is a particularly good example of how neighbors can work well together. Bangladesh has taken action to clamp down on the cross-border terrorists who have targeted India from that part of the world. And India has made a lot of progress. The boundary disputes that existed with Bangladesh and India for decades were resolved under Prime Minister Modi. There is a resumption of train line connectivity. There is a resumption of electricity power grid connectivity. There is a resumption of road highways connectivity. Work is going on towards all of this. And so I think that reflects the priorities about the neighborhood first policy.
Thank you, sir. With the rise of India as an economic power with rapid economic development, placing it at world's fifth, the aspiration of its neighbors, including Nepal, has also increased. So how can Nepal and India work together for economic transformation of the country?
I think Nepal and India are natural allies. Like I mentioned in my talk, there are very, very long historical and cultural ties. And even economically, if you look at the modern states of Nepal and the modern states of India, the economic ties are extremely close and growing. It's natural that sometimes over the course of years, there may have been particular disagreements on certain subjects, but that doesn't impact the overall picture that we are natural allies on many fronts. India, of course, has certain concerns. We live in a neighborhood where we face on our western border a particular terrorist threat. I told you that we have resolved most of those problems on our eastern border. These are issues that we expect our neighbors to be sensitive to our concerns. Everybody in the world has seen how India has suffered from externally targeted terrorism. We have made tremendous progress in tackling that ourselves. And of course, we expect friendly nations to recognize our genuine concerns and to work with us. But other than that, we should be increasing the infrastructure connectivity. What is happening with Bangladesh? There are similar things happening with Nepal, but I think we should step it up much more to have much more infrastructure and economic connectivity between India and Nepal.
Thank you, sir. You talk about terrorism, and also how can India display its growing role in the global millennium, like contributing effectively to the World Community of Nations in combating international cross-border terrorism and expanding its trade relations with other countries?
India has a principled position that that stands firmly against terrorism. Now, there are certain nations who have a policy that sometimes flip-flops on terrorism. Some nations have had a differential view about when terrorism affects them at home and when terrorism affects other countries, especially developing countries. Now, we don't have that viewpoint. We unilaterally condemn terrorism wherever it happens, whether it happens in India, whether it happens in the US or Nepal or Bangladesh. We condemn terrorism unilaterally, universally, without any qualms. Now, beyond that, we have taken many steps. I mentioned about our relationship with the Quad, with the democratic nations of the US, Japan, and Australia to work together. A lot of this achieves common purposes, such as tackling piracy on the high seas, such as tackling interference by other nations in keeping the sea lanes free and accessible. These all are related subjects. We are very clear that in tackling terrorism, there must be absolutely no room given, no quarter given, because all other problems can be settled by negotiation, but not terrorism.
So you just mentioned about Quad, and we have received lots of questions on Quad. So let me put one of them, like, how do you look at India's engagement with the United States and Japan, as both of these countries stand together with India on Quad?
Great question. So I want to reiterate something that I said earlier, which is that democracies have a fundamental DNA which helps them to have shared interests, which helps them to have a better ability to cooperate and to play in a rules-based world. Now, there may have been difficulties in the past, for example, during the Cold War, because India was in such a low developmental stage that we depended on food aid to prevent starvation. So that was a different era. Today, as I have said, we have transitioned into becoming a pretty significant aid giver to other nations around the world. But it's not just about aid. It's about, other nations must also all play by the rules of the world. You can't have one set of rules as you are benefiting from them. And once you reach a certain size, you can't have a different set of rules preventing free flow of maritime trade, disregarding other nations' sovereignty. So we must have a very clear approach that we must respect each other's sovereignty. We must respect each other's physical boundaries, and yet we can cooperate on economic and geopolitical and security fronts. So recently, as you know, India is regularly invited to G7 summits, although we aren't formally part of G7. Similarly, the multilateral institutions of the world, which were set up in 1940s, they're mismatched with current realities. So there is a call for reform of UN Security Council, not just by India, but by many other nations who support India's position there. So I think you will see more and more increasingly that democracies will have to work closer together, because there is indeed something special about democracies that other nations don't have, irrespective of their economic or military power.
Thank you, sir. There's another question which is very similar to, again, Indo-Pacific counterterrorism coming together, because that is maximum question we are getting on these two subjects. Like in the strategic arena, India has been playing a pioneering role at regional platforms. It has been ramping up its capabilities in defense, its regional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, counterterrorism, and technology. In this context, do you think India has the capacity to become the net security provider in the region?
So I think let's start with the terminology itself. You have referred to the region as the Indo-Pacific, which it has only recently in the last few years again started being called, because for many decades it used to be called the Asia-Pacific by the developed Western nations, which were major powers. Now, if you look at historical realities, India had trade connections and civilizational connections throughout the Indian Ocean and across in many the Indian Ocean rim nations. And so this terminology itself of, again, calling it the Indo-Pacific over the last few years, is a recognition that India plays a role, and with its economic emergence and its geopolitical emergence and its increased confidence in dealing with multilateral institutions in a rules-based way, means that India will cooperate with other democracies to help provide security, to help provide a rules-based world in the Indo-Pacific as well as in other parts of the world. Now, as I said, we had a diffidence coming out of colonial rule in the 1940s. And for decades, we had that diffidence about our economy. We had that diffidence about playing a role because of our colonial experience, because of our experience with the East India Company. But we have come out of that. And with increasing confidence, we have this ancient belief in the world, the Committee of Nations, all having common interest. The one point I want to end with on this issue is that in my experience, in my 19 years in Parliament, where I focused a lot on foreign policy, and I have attended literally hundreds of track 2 events with the US, with Japan, with Australia, with China, with even Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Israel. I can tell you that my experience was that with almost no exceptions, with very, very few exceptions, most nations welcome India's emergence. They see India as non-threatening. They see India having a cooperative attitude. They see India wanting to find win-win solutions. And I think increasingly that is becoming evident by our policies.
Thank you. So there's one very general question, but still I want to put it at the end of this session. Like, as a rising power, what is India's vision to the world?
I think I partly answered this in the last question. So if you look at India's ancient traditions, we were a center of learning. We were a center of global trade and commerce. People from the Roman Empire to the Greeks to the Chinese, all to the Mongols, all looked at India as a rich place or as a place to come and get educated. We still have the ruins of many ancient universities. For several centuries, we lost that position and that confidence. And we went through a few hundred years of foreign rule. And now we are rediscovering ourselves. We are rediscovering that much of our ancient ethos has a modern resonance. So this juxtaposition of, for example, yoga today is a global phenomenon. The belief in natural remedies and the belief in practices such as Ayurveda is finding increasing global acceptance in many countries where the healthcare system has gone completely awry. And so in many aspects, if you look at, for example, Bollywood, our music and our cinema has a global influence that is, it's not just limited to the world. The largest diaspora in the world is India. There are something like 18 million Indian citizens who live around the world, not to mention many, many more people of Indian origin in different continents. So, but it's not just that. So I think the vision that we have is a renaissance of India, a renaissance which is the coming together of the best of our traditional values and the best of modern scientific values and the spirit of cooperation and living together.